Let's move to the medieval Bosnia and Huum. Departing from the preceding contextual problem, the remaining part of this video is devoted to the historical reconstruction of the genesis of the Bosnian Croats. Its starting point can be found in the early Middle Ages, to which the history of the majority of today's European nations stands in continuity. Only 3 narrative sources, on the South Slavic lands in the early Middle Ages, have been preserved. The first of these, which is cited under the title De Administrando Imperio, was composed in the middle of the 10th century, and ascribed to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, that is 300 years after the beginning of the settlement of the South Slavs, in their new homeland. With regard to these Slavic settlers, Porphyrogenitus speaks of the Croats and Serbs under their names, which they brought from the proto-homeland, while the remaining Slavs are mentioned under tribal or regional names, for example, Zaklamoi, Turbuniates, Canalites, Diocletians, Arantanoi, while the Bosniani or Bosnians are not mentioned. The second narrative source is dedicated to the history of the Church of Salona, modern Solin, and later split from Roman times to 1266. It was written by Thomas, the Archdeacon of Split, who lived in the 13th century, in the work Historia Salonitana. Thomas calls the Croats Goths, and speaks much of the relations between the autochthonous Roman and newly settled Slavic or Croatian element through 600 years, while he mentions Bosnia only in passing. Historiography dates the emergence of the third narrative source, known under the name the Chronicle of the Priest of Dioclea, or the Genealogy of Bar, to the second half of the 12th century. The text is very complex, and a critical analysis of it points to a number of paradigms. The mediated information is frequently very nebulous, and not one piece is dated. For this reason, this source is ideal for speculation and desirable constructs of the distant past. The furthest to go in this direction, on the Croatian side, was Dominik Mandić, Muhammad Haji Yahić on the Bosniak side, and Relija Novaković on the Serbian, as well as, of course, their publicistic epigones. Each of them made a particular effort to reconstruct a still wider political space for their own ethnic groups, Croatian, Bosniak, Serbian, in the early Middle Ages.
In the newest period, spanning through the last 3 to 4 decades, these sources have been submitted to sometimes devastating critiques and works of preeminent Croatian and Serbian historians who oscillate between 2 extremes: on one hand, younger, and in some cases, older generation of Croatian historians tend to look on them either as imaginative historical fictions, and hence only documents of Croatian and Serbian growth of proto-national consciousness, or mythic narratives creatively transcribed from other European sources. On the other hand, critical Serbian historians are trying to salvage basic elements of these works, unsure which part of these sources should be treated as relatively reliable and which is a pure fiction. The most important names are authors Mladen Ančić, Daniel Gino, Neven Budak, Tibor Živković, Ljubomir Gadić. Bosniak historians have, generally, not participated in heated discussions on those topics. What remains undisputed is that the first 400 years of Slavic-speaking peoples' migrations in what are now Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia remain widely open to discussions and criticism due to lack of significant sources, which is not the case with the early French, English, or Scandinavians. The remaining historians accepted the information from the 3 aforementioned narrative sources as starting points for further research, but they introduced less conjecture into them and preferred to leave them as informative torsos. They filled those gaps, which could be confirmed or corrected with meager facts, mediated through other sources, archaeological remains, and marginal records. In recent times this approach has been applied with the scientific precision and persuasiveness craved for by the Croatian philologist, Indo-Europeanist, and literary historian, Radoslav Kardicic. In his classical work, Literarum Studia, on which he worked for nearly 20 years, Kardicic succeeded in reconstructing the developmental lines of early medieval Croatian cultural history. To be sure, due to the scarcity of preserved historical sources, Kardicic's synthesis also has not ceased being a torso, but the main lines have acquired clear contours.
Kardicic systematically follows the centuries-old cultural coalescing between what he calls the indigenous Roman element and the settled Slavic or Croatian element on the eastern Adriatic coast. This cultural process lasted until humanism and the Renaissance in the 15th century. Even in the 15th century, debate in the political bodies of the Republic of Dubrovnik was conducted in Ragusian, a Romance language, while the last original speaker of the Vigliot, the Romance idiom on the island of Kirk, died in 1898. The baptizing of the Croats began immediately after their settlement in the 7th century, issuing from the Romance Dalmatian towns, which were under the supreme political rule of Byzantium, but belonged to the Roman Church in an ecclesiastical and cultural sense. At the beginning of the 9th century, Carolingian missionaries, most probably originating from Aquileia, participated in the baptizing of the Croats. They made use of popular Slavic elements in their catechisms, and in doing so, prepared the soil for Cyrillo-Methodian Christianization and culture, which will receive completely clear outlines from the second half of the 9th to the 11th century. In that way, the Croatian bilingual, Latin and Slavic culture, employing three alphabets, Latin, Glagolitic and Cyrillic, was born and further developed, a unique example in European relations. 4. It is not a question of the parallel existence of an erudite Latin education and the popular language of the illiterate, which is otherwise characteristic for the European West, but rather, of two equally erudite and schooled literary traditions.
How did things stand in that respect with neighboring Bosnia? When Bosnia is in question in this context, it should be emphasized that Bosnia was less exposed to the permanent influences of the Dalmatian Roman towns because it was situated in the hinterland. Nevertheless, the meager records on the influence of the Salonitan metropolitan on the ecclesiastical organization in Bosnia are confirmed by the archaeological remains of churches on the territory of today's Bosnia, which derive from the period before and after the Austro-Gothic rule between 490 and 535 AD, and the Slavic of our political alliance during the 7th and 8th centuries. The western half of today's Bosnia, stretching to the Verbas River, was, until the Ottoman conquests in the 15th century, a region of Croatian ecclesiastical and political processes, while it came under the political rule of medieval Bosnian rulers only during the 14th century. Porphyrogenitus' account, very convincingly, legitimates the situation in the 10th century. Here it is said, "From the Croats who came to Dalmatia, a part split off, and possessed themselves of Illyricum and Pannonia. They too had an independent prince, who used to maintain friendly contact, though through envoys only, with the Prince of Croatia." Bosnia was certainly located in this Illyricum, as one of Porphyrogenitus Sclavinias, so named because the language, faith, legal order, and oral literature were Slavic. The mythological, ceremonial, and legal texts were delivered orally according to the Slavic tradition, from generation to generation.
By the 11th century, the Cyrillo-Methodian Slavicization of Christianity on the territory of today's Bosnia was conducted in its entirety and extended to the most western parts of today's Republic of Croatia, to Istria. The scriptorial influence of Croatian Glagolitic on the tablet of Humats in today's Western Herzegovina from the 10th or 11th century, written in Cyrillic, is identifiable, while in the Bosnian diocese, which is first mentioned under that name in preserved sources on 8 January 1089, the Slavic language was used exclusively at that time. Alongside the Western Cyrillic, which will flourish in Bosnia and Huum and in the neighboring Croatian Dalmatian regions, until the beginning of the 19th century, the parallel use of the Glagolitic script will continue to the beginning of the 15th century. Changes in the political influences on Bosnia will also lead to a change in the suffragan position of the Bosnian diocese between the metropolitans in Split, Bar, and Dubrovnik. During the reign of Ban Quilin, from 1170 until 1204, the Bosnian diocese was a suffragan to the Archbishopric of Dubrovnik. In that period, the first reports of the appearance of heresy in Quilin's Bosnia were also recorded. With that, there began a new period in the political, ecclesiastical, and cultural history of medieval Bosnia. With the support of the Hungarian King Emmerich I, and with the consent of the Bosnian Ban Quilin, the papal legate John de Casamares arrived in Bosnia. On 8 April 1203, in Belinopolia, a locality near Zenica or Visokor, Casamares obliged the suspected Bosnian Christians, Christiani, to a confession of orthodoxy. The text of this abjuration has been preserved in the Latin language. The Christiani in Belinopolia accepted the abjuration without objection. After that, there reigned a lull, until the beginning of the second decade of the 13th century. At that time, inquisitorial, military, and missionary actions were organized for Bosnia, from Hungary, with the support of Rome. The result of these actions was the proclamation of the Bosnian Church as heretical in 1233, and the simultaneous establishment of a new diocese with a Latin ritual. The Dominicans were engaged as inquisitors, missionaries, and the first bishops at the time of the installation of the new Latin diocese, under the political patronage of Hungary. From that time, until the collapse of the Bosnian Kingdom, we have two Christian churches, and two alphabets in medieval Bosnia: the Bosnian Church, with the Slavic language, suspected of heresy, and separated from Rome, and the newly established Latin diocese, with the Latin language and, from 1247, the position of a suffragan, in relation to the metropolitan in Hungarian Kalosca. The seat of the newly established Latin diocese was transferred from Bosnia to Đakovo in the middle of the 13th century, while the historical sources, regarding the activity of the Dominicans, after that are quiet, all the way to the arrival of the Franciscans, who will push the Dominicans out of Bosnia in the second decade of the 14th century.
The Franciscan mission in Bosnia had a different political and social framework and achieved different results. The first recorded account on the appearance of a Franciscan monk in Bosnia originates from 1248, but the decisive step in setting up the Franciscan mission began with the arrival in Bosnia of the general of the Franciscan order, Gerard O'Donis, and the establishment of the Bosnian vicary in 1339 or 1340, established in agreement and cooperation with the Bosnian Ban Stephen Kotromanic II. The administrative seat of the Bosnian vicary was erected in central Bosnia, and due to its extension into non-Bosnian regions, the vicary was divided and organized into custodies, custodii. According to the registry of Franciscan Bartolo from Pisa, composed between 1385 and 1390, in the second half of the 14th century, the Bosnian vicary had 7 custodies with 35 monasteries. According to the aforementioned registry, which did not encompass all the monasteries of the vicary of that time, the following 4 monasteries were located in central Bosnia: Visoko, Kraljeva Srpska, Olovo and Lashva. The 8th custody of St. Catherine in Apulia was added to the Bosnian vicary in 1393. Changes will occur in the demarcation between individual custodies, in other words, their separation, renaming, and annexation to the Bosnian vicari, but by the Ottoman conquest, their number will come to 8.
Historians who, for whatever reason, diminished the accounts of Franciscan missionary successes in medieval Bosnia, stressed the great spatiality of the Bosnian vicari, and emphasized that the reports of Franciscan successes related to the whole area of the vicari, so that they, therefore, concluded that their success in Bosnia itself was small. In contrast to such reasoning, there stands the fact that the number of Franciscan monasteries and residences on the territory of today's Bosnia and Herzegovina reached over 40 during the 15th century, which is not a small number. From a social and economic perspective, the Franciscan entry into medieval Bosnia is closely tied to the development of medieval urbanization in Bosnia during the 14th and 15th centuries, the opening of mines, and the emergence of trading and artisan settlements followed the erection of Franciscan monasteries and churches. The Franciscans were not only politically and socially anchored in medieval Bosnia, but they also cultivated two types of literacy in that period: the domestic literature written in Western Cyrillic, and the Latin, which was introduced in Bosnia before the Franciscans by the Dominicans. A similar condition existed at the court of the Bosnian kings. Alongside Cyrillic charters, on which the influence of the Serbian chancellery, after King Truko's occupation of Western Serbia, is recognizable, for the Bosnian kings established dynastic ties with Serbia, extended their rule over Serbian regions, and brought Serbian scribes to their court. There also existed in the chancellery of the Bosnian kings a Latin section, in which charters were copied in the Latin language. In its contacts with the Balkan hinterland, the Republic of Dubrovnik had a separate Slavic, sometimes called Serbian chancellery, and employed Western Cyrillic in its communication with Bosnia. One can easily differentiate between Dubrovnik's Slavic language type in communication with Bosnia before and after Truko's conquest of parts of Serbian lands. Croatian or Bosnian Western Shtokavian, in its pure form, had been afterwards frequently mixed with grammatically and lexically typical Serbian features.
There is no direct confirmation concerning the relation of the Franciscans toward the medieval sepulchral culture of tombstones and their Cyrillic epitaphs. The century-old research of these monuments, of which there are 100,000 examples throughout medieval Bosnia and Huam, as well as neighboring regions, brought to light that these tombstones were erected by members of all three Christian churches, Bosnian Church, Catholic Church and Orthodox Church, and that they do not reflect any separate heretical, bogomil theology or symbolism, but a general Christian medieval understanding of death, expressed in the vocabulary and ritual of the individual churches, blended with folk conceptions. In the second half of the 20th century, historical science freed itself from the attempt to bogomilize the Bosnian Church, observing that in question was not a sect driven to rebellion by its contemporary enemies, but an ecclesiastical institution with a classic Christian dogma and integrated in the Bosnian medieval feudal society. Good evidence for this statement is the testament of Radan Butković, high official of the Bosnian Church, dated in 1466, which is published in nearly all monographs on the Bosnian Church. Exposed to the pressures of the Roman Curia and Hungarian politics and the missionary activity of the Franciscans from the West, as well as the competitive behavior of the Serbian Orthodox Church from the East, the Bosnian Church fell into a centuries-old defensive position and, in face of the Ottoman conquest, disappeared from the historical stage.